everyone. My name is Jeannie Zhang. You are a estate planning attorney.
And I'm Katie Thompson, an associate at Springdale Law Group.
Clayton's election is a special protected trust where the surviving spouse can use but cannot lose for the benefits of the future heirs. Like, for example, the surviving spouse can only live in the house that you leave to the surviving spouse, but the surviving spouse cannot sell the house. That's a quick example. In this type of trust that you can give the surviving spouse various degrees of control or use during his or her lifetime, as well as the ability to distribute those assets upon his or her death. So without the protected trust, what normally would happen is the surviving spouse will have full control over everything. So if you passed away, your surviving spouse will have full control over all your assets and have the full authority to decide who is the beneficiary or maybe change the beneficiary.
One of the prime examples that people might think of on this one is if you had kids from a previous marriage. If you have a regular marital trust, what it does is it allows that second spouse to choose if they would want to keep those children from that first marriage as beneficiaries, or if they want to benefit any children that might come from the second marriage or anyone that second spouse would want to benefit. I think probably the most common thing, the most common reason that anyone would want to go ahead and make that Clayton election and get a Q-tip trust is the taxation consequences. So what the Clayton exemption actually does is it allows the surviving spouse to utilize the proceeds or income that comes off of a corpus. So what that would mean is if you have a house or if you have a large amount of money, that money is actually held by the trust, but the income or proceeds that come from that money, either in the form of investments or dividends or anything like that, that is able to be distributed to your surviving spouse. Now, on those dividends and proceeds, the spouse can make an election on their IRS paperwork for this Clayton exemption, and it allows that surviving spouse to use the marital deduction. And where this matters is the independent deduction for estate planning is currently at $12 million, and the marital deduction is currently at $24 million. Now, that amount is subject to change. Congress and the president can work together to be able to change that amount, and it does change over time. So even if you don't have $12 million anywhere close to it, that amount has been made lower, $2, $3, and $6 million before. So it's something to think about if you have, more than $1 million in your estate, because that is an amount that could be taxed. So what it does on the first level is it provides to that surviving spouse the ability to take that marital deduction, which is typically about twice the amount of taxation or the amount of money for the taxation versus the individual amount. The second thing that it also does, in addition to protecting for the income, is what it does to protect the actual corpus itself. So that amount of money that's being held by the trust. The other thing that it does in protecting the corpus is to protect the beneficiaries. So typically, if a person dies, they make the step up in basis, or you get taxed on the goods at the time of death. What the Q-tip trust can do is it can kick the can down to the distribution for the actual corpus to the beneficiaries. So there is no taxation that's paid on that amount at the time of the first spouse's death, and it's only paid at the time after that second spouse's death when the distribution itself is made. So it saves the potential tax consequences that you would have, because again, tax rates go up and down. And so it's possible that during this time period that the first spouse has died, that the taxes are particularly high. Right. And you want to see if the taxes will be lower at that second time, or you want to protect a portion of that overall corpus for that surviving spouse to be able to get their benefits.
So Katie just mentioned the 2 layers of tax benefits right there. Most of the people choose Clayton's election is because this is the most cost-effective way to have a protected trust in place at the beginning, because we don't know when we die how big is your estate. We don't know how much is the exemption amount. So all those factors might change. So there's a lot of uncertainty right there. That's why most of the people choose this protection to prevent the uncertainty, to prepare for the uncertainty and then the future changes.
And the fact of the matter is, we don't know. We can't guess what Congress is going to do in the future. And you don't know how long you're going to live either. So what is Congress going to do in X amount of time? Good luck trying to figure that one out.
There are 4 other situations where the Clinton's election works best. Remember, we mentioned that the protected trust is where that you give the surviving spouse varying degrees of control and as well as the ability to distribute the assets upon their death. So there are the following 4 situations that you might want to consider.
The first and probably most common situation is going to be a blended family. Basically, the way it works is you have a spouse that has children from a prior marriage, and you're wanting to protect the benefits for those children from a prior marriage. In one of our previous videos, we talked about how in the state of Texas, if you died without estate planning, that those children could in fact see some dramatic changes with Texas's intestacy laws. So having the estate planning and having this Clayton election will definitely be able to protect that. So you never know. You may be very happily married, and with the time that you unfortunately pass, your spouse may decide to remarry or may have other family members that they would like to benefit. And if you had a standard marital trust, because everything passes and is under the control of that second spouse, they can make those elections to go ahead and make those payouts to other people, which would leave nothing for the beneficiaries that you would want, those first children, or they could spend the entirety of the corpus, leaving nothing. So one of the reasons that you would get a Q-tip trust is to protect the interests of the children of that first marriage or beneficiaries that for whatever reason, you think that that surviving spouse wouldn't necessarily want to benefit. So what the Q-tip does is it creates 2 separate trusts. It creates the Q-tip trust and the bypass trust. And those trusts, because the first spouse has died, are irrevocable. So what that means is you've actually set in stone who the beneficiaries are. So that surviving spouse can't make those changes and change out the beneficiaries at that time. So what it does is it would keep, as we've talked about, the income that comes from that large corpus, and those would be allowed to be distributed to the surviving spouse during the remainder of their lifetime. But the actual corpus itself is going to go to the named beneficiaries, whoever those are named by the first spouse.
How about remarried? For example, we have a lot of clients who are young couples and they are at their 30s or 40s, right? They might get remarried.
Again, what that does is it's saving for you that ability to make that election before you pass. So even if you're young, you don't have a blended family yet, but there's the possibility that you might have a second marriage, go ahead and set up that Clayton exemption now, if nothing else for the positive taxation consequences, and then you can set it in stone. So you can plan ahead. And if you make that Clayton exemption now, while you're creating your initial estate planning, it's going to be far cheaper than it will be in the future around the time of your decease, because you'd have to create an entirely new estate plan. So doing it at the point that you're initially setting up the estate plan is going to be the cheapest and easiest way for you to be able to set yourself up.
This will be considered as the majority change, right? So if you don't add this protection right now and you do it later, it will cost more.
Correct. You'll have to redo your estate planning and it would cost far more than it would to just go ahead and set it up with your initial estate plan.
The third scenario is if one of the spouse is not really good with money, you might want to have a Clinton's election. Because like if one spouse died and the surviving spouse doesn't know how to manage the assets, or maybe I will just like go ahead and spend it without hiring an independent financial advisor to manage the assets, then before it passes on to the next generation, probably the assets are already gone, right?
Well, and I think something that's important about this third scenario, it doesn't have to be that the remaining spouse is not particularly good with money. It just may be that you don't want to burden that spouse with having to deal with a multi-million-dollar estate. That's a lot. Dealing with a multi-million dollar estate, dealing with investments, dealing with the managing of that estate is a lot. And so one of the things that you can do with the Clayton election is remove that burden from the remaining spouse by being able to, you can set an independent trustee that's able to better manage that so that it's not something that other remaining spouse has to worry about. So basically you'd use it here because you want to be able to save that corpus. So here it would be important if you did have a spouse that was not particularly good with money or not particularly money savvy. It would also be good, again, if you just want to remove that stress and that burden from the remaining spouse. So essentially what it would do is it would allow someone that was more versed in money to be able to be named as that independent trustee so that the remaining spouse is not having to try to manage a multi-million dollar account, just because that takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of know-how.
If one of the spouse has the possibility to be sued as a malpractice, for example, lawyers or doctors, the surviving spouse's job has a high risk, then the surviving spouse might have creditors. Then you might want to choose the Clayton's election with the extra protection. Then you can choose the independent trustee to manage that assets. Then the surviving spouse will only have the access to the income, but does not own the principals directly. So in that way, it will protect the surviving spouse from the creditors.
Yes, it wouldn't just be, definitely you should have it if you're in a professional situation where you could be sued for malpractice, but anyone that could generally be in a risk situation where they're likely to be sued, or if they have significant debt or creditors. So again, what that does is it means that the income for that surviving spouse is only the payouts that we've talked about. So the income that's actually made off of the corpus or the principal itself. So what it does is it protects that majority amount of money that you want to give to the beneficiaries from being potentially exposed at the time of there being a significant judgment against that person, or if there's major credit debt for that person. So again, it provides another layer of protection for those beneficiaries that you want at the end to be able to get that full corpus amount. And you can use this oftentimes, we'll have another video about this one. You'll use this in conjunction with another protection that we have, the LAPT. And we have a video that will be coming up that'll tell you more about that one. But it provides one layer of protection against that, which is a great reason to also take that Clayton exemption.
Yeah. Well, there's another way to think about this. If you choose this additional protection, then you can maximize amount of the assets that will be passed on to your children because you already set up the actual protection for your surviving spouse. And most of our clients are like lawyers or doctors, and this is the number one reason that why they choose Clayton's election.
Yes, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but also think about the fact that there are different levels of protections that you can build in. So you could, if you want to do that maximized protection, you could use that independent trustee like we talked about, where you could place a banker or a CPA or someone that has a better hold on how to invest the money and be able to make that income for that surviving spouse. But you don't have to go that far. You can also set different parameters for who the trustee can be. You can give that surviving spouse the ability to replace the independent trustee if for whatever reason they're not getting along, and give that surviving spouse a little bit of independence there. You can also set certain levels of distribution rights to that surviving spouse. So, I mean, don't think of this as a complete exemption, all or nothing. It allows you to have differing levels of participation by that surviving spouse, depending on how monetarily savvy they are, whether or not they have one of those professional jobs, whether or not there's a blended family, whether or not there's remarriage, and just to help with those taxation consequences like we've talked about.
And the most strong asset protection is where that you give an independent trustee the full authority to determine whether the distribution are made or not made to the surviving spouse. So in that way, the surviving spouse has the full protection, and then you can really maximize amount of the assets that you can pass on to the next generation.
For those reasons, the Clayton exemption is a great choice for pretty much anybody. because it provides you with all these different potential benefits if you find yourself in any of the 4 situations in the future, or if you're in any of those 4 situations now. But for really anybody, if you have a corpus that's worth about $1 million or more, to protect for the potential on both of those different types of taxation consequences. So for that reason, I highly suggest that if you're doing an estate planning with us, you talk to us about the potential for the Clayton exemption for you and what it might be able to do to benefit you.
Hopefully this video is helpful for you. And if you have any question, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to hear your story and getting to know your family. See you next time.
See you next time.